Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. James Fallon. He's professor of psychiatry and human behavior and emeritus professor of anatomy and neurobiology in the University of California, Irvine School of Medicine. His research interests include adult stem cells, chemical neuroanatomy and circuitry, higher brain functions, and brain imaging. And today we're going to focus on his book, The Psychopath Inside, a neuroscientist's personal journey into the dark side of the brain. So, Dr. Fallon, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Ricardo, great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, of course. It's a pleasure. So, tell us about psychopathy. What is it? I mean, what characterizes psychopathy and a psychopath?
You know, a psychopath is basically, in its simplest form, an intraspecies predator. That is, a human predator who is on other humans. And I guess one could say different apes can be psychopathic in the sense that they're predator on other gorillas and chimpanzees, et cetera. We see that kind of behavior. So intraspecies predator, and it is a controversial term because it overlaps with other sorts of problems. It overlaps with other personality disorders. You know, a psychiatric disorder is a clinically relevant alteration of one's thought patterns, but mostly emotions and social behavior. And so you have that general psychiatric disorders, which really is very stressful on somebody's life. A personality disorder is a smaller group where it really affects people's interactions, their social interactions with other people. And so it may not cause them a lot of problems. It causes other people a lot of problems. So there are many psychiatric disorders where people don't say anything, but they're suffering inside, and it really affects their life. Whereas the personality disorders usually involve your effect on other people. It includes really a serious social disorder. And of the personality disorders, there are three that are particularly pernicious in this regard. And they're the ones that cause the most damage. One is psychopathy, or its somewhat similar antisocial personality disorder. Now, I'm saying that because it shows another problem, because they're not exactly the same thing. Mm-hmm. So when people think of psychopathy, it's not exactly antisocial personality disorder, but for the time being, let's say they're very similar. The other type is a narcissistic personality disorder, which is almost always damaging on other people. And then there's borderline, people who are borderline personality disorders. That's the third dangerous one. And they account in psychiatry for a high percentage of the murders and abuse, et cetera, of other people. And so psychopathy, or its relative antisocial personality disorder, are that one of that group. And, you know, the thing about a personality disorder that makes it a bit different than regular disorders, if you will, is that the people who have it, they really believe their own stuff, right? And so somebody who is narcissistic, where they're acting sometimes know they're acting that way. They often feel like they're inferior, and so it's a compensation for their inferiority. And so those people will know about that. Somebody with narcissistic personality disorder, on the other hand, they really believe what they're doing is fine and good and okay. And same thing with somebody with sociopathy. Now, sociopathy and psychopathy seem very similar, but they're not, because the person who has these have very different thoughts about what they're doing. And so it's important in the diagnosis. And so for somebody with sociopathy, they are usually pissed off losers. They think they're losers, they know they're losers, and they're getting even with the world or a specific group of people in the world. for some sort of offense to either their family, to them, somebody who, some boy or man at 16 years old who abuses redheaded women, and you can usually trace it back to some redhead when they were young who refused their advances, or caused them some embarrassment or pain. So it can be very specific, but also terrorists. Many of the terrorists are sociopaths, some are psychopaths, but the terrorists are getting even with the world for an offense. And they know what they're doing is probably wrong. They oftentimes can feel remorse over this and can feel sorry for it at some point because they know what they're doing is wrong. Whereas a psychopath thinks what they're doing is perfectly fine. And so there's no guilt, there's no remorse, and this is very different. Even though they can do the same things, they can kill the same, they can rape the same, they can abuse people, they can steal from them, or they can be a real jerk, a serious jerk, beyond a jerk. But they think it's perfectly fine. And so they have no sense of morality about this, which is an interesting quandary. And I'll finish with this one short, description. In that, in most of Western and Eastern religions, and certainly all the Abrahamic religions like Christianity, Catholicism, Protestantism, Judaism, Muslim, in order for something to be a sin, you have to know it's a sin. And so in that sense, sociopaths are the sinners because they know what they're doing is wrong and they do it anyway. Whereas a psychopath really doesn't have a sense of morality or moral reasoning. And so they're not evil. They're not the sinners. They're more dangerous, but they're not the sinners so there's all these funny contradictions, if you will, curiosity about it. But if you zone down, there's 10 personality disorders. 3 are called cluster B. One of them is psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder. And so that's drilling down into the one mental disorder.
Mm-hmm. But because you mentioned other disorders, other personality disorders in this case, how do you think we should think about psychiatric disorders? Do they really occur or on a continuum?
Within the past, and certainly we've been doing this in our group, in our extended group of maybe 100 people in this field since about 1996, 97, where we really started to look at psychiatric disorders from the point of view of biological psychiatry. That is, we added in brain imaging, genetics, with the psychiatric part of it. And we started to look at them not as individual separable disorders, but rather as traits. People have different traits. And so this is different than the categorical thinking of you have this psychiatric disorder, you have that, because there's so much overlap and confusion, right? If you look at psychopathy, part, of the 2 main factors in psychopathy, one looks like narcissism, and the other has to do with criminality. And so it's a confusing, they overlap. And also there is if you look at different kinds of psychopathy or different kinds of these disorders, cluster Bs, there's about 10 of them, or 12 of them. And so it really, like other psychiatric disorders, because we looked at these and very much like we define traits and types of schizophrenia, depression, Alzheimer's disease. There's over 100 genes associated with Alzheimer's. And with all the mix of these genes, there's almost an infinite number of Alzheimer's diseases. Same with depression, and same with these personality disorders. And so, more simply put, instead of trying to say they're this thing, right? You have this thing. Well, you have groups of traits, and they're on, like you're saying, a continuum. You can put them on a 0 to 10 continuum from nothing. Let's say one of the traits is narcissism. from very low, zero narcissism. Some people have zero narcissism, all the way up to 10, which is severe, overwhelming narcissism. And so we put them all defined on a scale, like you just said, and then regress them statistically. That is, correlate them with different alleles, different forms of genes, and different brain patterns of superactivation or low activation. And we put this into a mathematical statistical model now. And we've used this for, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, depression, other disorders. And it quite hasn't been done yet for psychopathy or some of these personality disorders because they're even more complicated. So if there's 100 or 200 schizophrenias, there's probably, there may be 100, if you wanted to, types of psychopathy. And so this is the Tower of Babel a bit, in that it's a whole different way of looking at things. That is what's called the research domain. There's a domain that has to do with these traits. It's a trait analysis rather than a categorical psychiatric analysis that we're used to. And this new way of looking at things is individual or personalized psychiatry, right? Just like we know we have personalized medicine for many things, this has brought psychiatry and psychology into that way of thinking. And we've been doing that, in our group, our extended group, which is all across North America and some in Europe, who met for years, 10 years, 15 years to redefine it that way. And now the NIH, National Institute of Health and Mental Health, are going that way. But, like anything which contains difficult concepts and techniques, psychiatrists and psychologists and insurance companies and, just about everybody is kicking and screaming, especially older guys like me, right? And so you don't want to go through medical school or graduate school and get clinical degree. You don't want to go through this in years and decades of work and then only find out at 50 or 60 years old that you have to relearn all the genetics, relearn all the brain imaging, all the new statistical ways of looking at it. And people refuse to do it. So you have to wait. This is the classical thing. You have to wait for people in our generation to all die. And once they're dead, people who have learned new ways of doing this, people who are now, Gen Xers and also Gen Ys and even early millennials are learning these techniques. And so it takes about 20 years, a generation, to remove that the other way of thinking. Even though many people who refuse to learn this new way of looking at psychiatry, that it's too difficult, it's too disruptive for their own lives and their practices. So we just have to wait. I would say it's been going on now for almost 25 years. So probably within another 5 or 10 years, when a younger group is coming through, they're going to know these techniques and ways of thinking, and then it will replace it. And then we'll have Ricardo's dream way of looking at psychiatry, which is according to these scales and these continua.
Yeah, but from the point of view of biological psychiatry and with the inclusion of things like neuroscience, genetics, neuroendocrinology maybe, do you think that it is or it will be possible to diagnose psychiatry or even any other psychological or psychiatric disorder by doing some tests, imaging, for example, like we do for other diseases that are not mental?
Yeah. Well, I think the best take-home message is that you can't diagnose somebody with these personality disorders or psychiatric disorders by looking at their genetics or brain scans. Okay? It's defined in part by what the patient thinks about what they're doing. And you have to do that by, like I said, there's a big difference between a sociopath and a psychopath, right? And it depends on how they think about their behaviors and their thoughts, their actions. And so you do that by interviews, structured and unstructured interviews with a psychiatrist or psychologist. And so it's that interview, including some tests that you take online, et cetera, or through a computer. Those together, that's how you define a psychopath. So you can't get it from the biological stuff. But once you have a diagnosis, then you can say why you're like that. And that's when the genetics and the brain imaging come in. So it's not if you have it, it's why you have it. That's the biological psychiatry part.
Okay. And what do we know about the biological aspects of psychopathy? For example, do we have good behavioral genetics studies on it?
Well, there is no psychopathic gene, okay?
Yeah.
But there are forms of genes, the alleles, the different forms, because there's many forms of the same genes, and which combination you have depends on a random assortment that you inherited from your parents. You get one set of the alleles from your mother, one set from your father, and all of those together will form a complex of perhaps 10, 20, 30, 40 alleles that together will determine basic personality traits. So basic personality traits, assuming a normal upbringing, is determined genetically. Okay, so if you have a normal upbringing, you are pretty much, your genetics, and it's only when there's early abuse from birth to 2 or 3 that you then will affect the regulation of these genes in a permanent way that is associated with a personality disorder like psychopathy. And so there are groups of alleles of genes and transmitters that are associated with the traits of psychopaths, but there's no genes of psychopathy. Those are two different things, right? And so if you look at it, psychopaths where measurements have been made and, tend to be higher in dopamine and low in norepinephrine and serotonin and have GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, neurotransmitter levels. And it's associated with the genetic alleles that process those transmitters. So, for example, the most famous gene, the warrior gene, the first one that was discovered in 2002, is the promoter of the monoamine oxidase A receptor. So that particular promoter is the so-called warrior gene, but it's one of maybe 30, okay? And so if you just have that, that's a pretty powerful one, though. They're not all created equally. Some of the genetic alleles are more susceptible to epigenetic permanence. That is, the epigenetics is you have a genetic allele, and then if you have the abuse, trauma, heavy trauma early on, usually birth to 2 years old, then the regulators of those genes, it's almost like in a car where you take a brick and put a brick on the accelerator, so it's always on for the rest of your life, or put a brick on the brake, and so it tends to be really permanent in these, and that's what makes them different. None of the behaviors, you can murder somebody or you can be involved in a homicide. There's nothing wrong with it. There are circumstances where it's moral and legal to kill somebody if they're trying to kill you and your family. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, with these behaviors, with people with personality disorders, and here we're specifically talking about psychopaths, they're not regulated that way. It's out of context. It's out of social context. And therefore, it is very dangerous, and it becomes a pernicious act of the psychopath. And so, but you can go back and say there are genes, genetic alleles that code for the traits having to do with an important thing for psychopathy and narcissistic personality disorder is the type of empathy you have, right? We can talk about 4 kinds of empathy, and 2 of those have to do with the ability, like right now, Ricardo, I'm trying to read your emotional state. Okay. I'm trying to imagine what you're thinking, but what you're feeling in this conversation. Now, if I am successfully able to read your mind in that way, both cognitively, your thoughts, but also your emotions. That is a trait that's very useful, but that has to do with what's called cognitive empathy. It's so I know what you're thinking, and a normal person will take that and either ignore it or say, okay, you're hurting and I'm not going to help you. You need money, you need to discuss something, you need a connection. That's a normal response to having cognitive empathy. Emotional empathy is different. Emotional empathy is, Ricardo, I think I know what you're feeling, and in fact, I'm feeling your pain right now, or your happiness, or your dissatisfaction. And so the ability to mirror the actual emotions of others, that's emotional empathy. That's the one usually people like to think of when they think of empathy, but it's only one of the four kinds. And so there's a new one that was just found called dark empathy. That's a bit different. They're always coming up with new ways of differentiating this, different research groups. But anyway, the two basic types. So psychopaths have cognitive empathy. They know what you're feeling, but they use it against you. You see, that's the difference. They don't use it to help you. So the trait of having cognitive empathy, even though psychopaths have it, it's not a psychopathic trait, you see. So that's a different way of thinking of it. Mostly people want, when they marry somebody, they want to have some emotional empathy. With their parents, they want one to have emotional empathy and one to have cognitive empathy. Different ways of understanding you. Same thing with your best friends. Usually you have a best friend who you cry with and laugh with. You have an emotional, empathetic relationship with. And some people, it's just like they give you the cold, hard facts, which both are very useful, right? And so in that way, this is all part of these different traits of being part of a normal human being. So none of the actual traits of psychopathy are always psychopathic. They're not. It's just they're used in the wrong way. They're used out of context. And so if we look at this, there are, now I'm anticipating your next question, which is what are the genes? What are the genes associated with it? I mentioned the neurotransmitters that, many times psychopaths are extroverted and very gabby and very energetic, and that's a high dopamine thing, whereas they're lower in serotonin, which fits with the genetics of the MAOA, because the MAOA enzyme and COMT, catechol methyltransferase, is often psychopaths too, and they regulate, especially in the frontal lobe and partially in the temporal lobe, they regulate the amount of monoamines, which is dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, and those are the ones that are associated with psychopathy. There are others. Now, part of the energy that psychopaths have, and also the aggressiveness has to do with testosterone. And so psychopaths have an allele, a version, a combined version of the testosterone or androgen receptor that makes them selfish and very aggressive. Whereas the other form, even though it may lead men to be aggressive, for example, they're not selfish. They don't use it against you. A psychopath and somebody with this type of testosterone receptor will use their own money to punish you. They'll steal your money and use their own money. Whereas if you could be with somebody with very high testosterone and play poker with them, and they will aggressively try to win, but they will then buy everybody drinks. They'll give all the money back. So they still have aggressiveness, but they don't punish people with it, whereas a psychopath does. So the specific androgen or testosterone receptor is very important in addition to the level of testosterone. This is one reason why with psychopathy, when males with psychopathy get older, it tends to go down because their testosterone goes down, their level of aggression. So they may feel the same things, but they don't have the juice. They don't have the energy to really do anything. And so they become nicer in a sense, only because they run out of the energy to do it. And it's curious when you look at male versus female psychopaths or these behaviors, not just psychopaths, but the level of high aggression. it's partially not only determined by just testosterone, but the ratio of testosterone to estrogen. So if you have a high T to E, high testosterone to estrogen ratio, leads to very high aggression. As men get older, testosterone, as I mentioned, everybody knows, goes down, and the aggression of men goes down after 50, 60. Whereas women, the ratio of testosterone to estrogen goes up. So oftentimes you find normal women, your normal average women, as they get older, get much more aggressive than their husbands. It's like Bill and Hillary Clinton. He's a pussycat now, and she gets more extremely aggressive. Well, this is a typical pattern. So women, not that they become more psychopathic, but this trait of high aggression will increase because of that hormonal relationship. So like you mentioned, knowing the hormones and the different neurotransmitters is useful to explaining it. And there are other genes too. There are about 15 that are known, and most of that research originally was done at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee. But it's hard. There's not a lot of data on it. There just isn't. It's hard to get blood and DNA from psychopaths in prison because they manipulate the system, and so they don't want to have imaging done. They don't want to have genetics done because they're very manipulative of the legal system and of the public.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to how the brain is structured and organized, is there anything that is typical about the brains of psychopaths or not?
Yeah, when I first looked at a large group of murderers and serial killers, I had been doing that since 1989, but then in 2005, I got a whole bunch of them, many of them, and I compared them to normals and schizophrenics, and found there was a pattern of the psychopathic murderers, and it was typical of psychopaths. And I published that back in 2005 or 6, and because I don't think anybody had described the pattern of this psychopathy, the whole brain pattern. And even though there was different kinds of damage in these murderers, these psychopathic murderers, there was a common mode. There was a common group of structures that were turned off versus normals. And that had to do with the major parts of the prefrontal cortex, which included the orbital cortex up right above the eyes, and also the ventromedial cortex, more medially along the midline, and that continued into the cingulate cortex. Those were turned off when put into a scanner, like a PET scanner, fMRI. And the best way to look at it is with PET scanner, because you can compare individuals versus groups. With fMRI, you really can't do that. But anyway, we did it with all very high resolution PET scanner, and you could see those were turned off. But anyway, there was a continuation of part of the cingulate cortex, then down to the hippocampal area, which includes the hippocampus itself and the parahippocampal gyrus, then to the amygdala, and then that continued in this loop to the anterior insula, which is one of the very important areas for the type of empathy you have. And so I was able to see in different people that, the areas that were hot spots or cold spots were different if people with different kinds of empathy versus not, but certainly in the psychopaths, and I derived this from killers, and people have found some very similar things in other psychopaths. After this, that there was this pattern of this whole ring of cortex, which was limbic cortex, emotional and social regulation. So it did make a lot of sense. So those areas are turned off, but there are also some of these areas are turned off in other problems. So people with impulsive murderers, they had this orbital cortex was turned off, but the amygdala looked normal. Okay, so you get these different combinations of with these behaviors. So people find it hard to believe sometimes that I could be given, and anybody like me, anybody who knows a lot of neuroanatomy and behavior, can take a look at a scan and say, this is probably the personality traits of this person without knowing who they are. And I can do this quite well as people like me, who've seen many of these. You can say, well, this person has a language problem, probably a stutterer, probably very impulsive, has no sense of morality. So you can go through the traits, and it correlates pretty well with the combination of brain areas that are affected. Not one brain area, but correlated brain areas, the so-called connectome. There's these central areas that are hotspots, but they're connected to other areas. And so when you see those connected areas all turn way up or way down, it will really affect the traits in that person will follow that. It's quite remarkable how closely it will. And but there are people that have these areas turned on and off by themselves that don't have psychopathy, but they have the traits that are, either really aggressive or a certain kind of empathy without being a criminal or without having a categorical personality disorder, psychiatric disorder, but they have those traits.
Mm-hmm. What about the environmental factors? Earlier in our conversation, you mentioned, for example, abuse in the early years of life. Is there anything else we know about that might predispose toward psychopathy?
Well, Ricardo, this relates to the whole idea of nature and nurture, of environment versus genes, of course.
Yes.
Which goes back to Plato and Socrates, or the pre-Socratic idea. So, and I'm sure, people 20,000 years ago had these sort of thoughts like this, right? When the Greeks started talking and writing them down, we knew it, but these were probably old thoughts. It's like, what's causing? Is it what's inside of me, or what's causing it out there? So, after looking at it, my sort of conclusion is Plato is correct, Aristotle was wrong, Avicenna was wrong, John Locke was wrong. There are very few philosophers who got it right. That I say right, that is, who fit the last 10 or 15 years of modern neuroscience, knowing about epigenetics, because it's partially affected by historical, cultural, social norms. For example, we are still living in the shadow of the Enlightenment in French humanism, and that whole which is liberalism, and a form of a type of liberalism, and which says that all the bad things in the world are due to the environment. They're due to the government or the religion or something out there. There's nothing inside. You're born. Every child is born tabula rasa. Every child is born blank slate, and then we add on morality. We add on evil, and this turns out to be completely wrong. But it's something that has been in our lexicon and our thought patterns up until 10, 15 years ago. In fact, you still find it in schools, you still find it in universities, especially in the humanities. If you those people in universities that study music, art, humanities, I love these people, but they tend not to know any of this stuff, which is, and one key experiment is that our babies, human babies and rhesus monkeys, born with a fear of snakes, or do they learn it from their mothers? This has been a key thing. Well, it was found out about 10 years ago, a little bit more than 10 years ago, that both in humans and in rhesus monkeys are born with a fear of snakes. Well, this changes lots of things. Also, we know in the past 20 years of neuroscience research that children are born with a sense of morality and of good and evil and of beauty. You don't have to teach them this. And so it looks like, if you look at all complex human adaptive behaviors, kinds of fear, kinds of empathy, all these things, there's about 350 of them. And of these, they're also associated with personality traits. Well, it turns out that when you're born, these will develop on their own. You don't have to teach kids any of this. It develops naturally. And of course, if you talk to any parent, if you talk to any parent when the kids are born, they say, I'm going to create this child in my image. I'm going to, schools do the same thing, universities, religions. I'm going to make this a good Christian or Jewish child. I'm going to make this a great young Portuguese child. who's going to fit into the culture and in my family. Well, this is a dream. Forget it. The kid is going to go his own way or her own way, and these things will develop naturally. So this is a big shift in our understanding of human behavior and thought. But there are still, many people stuck with the sense of the Enlightenment and humanism, that we're all born beautiful and simple and ignorant, and it's only the society. And if we only control the society and the religion, then we can create the people we want. And it turns out to be nonsense. And so that's one answer. I'll let you go on now instead of. There's a lot to be said about that, but that's the basic idea from my point of view.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's another thing that might be related to that. If we have a full-blown psychopath, someone who is really antisocial and commits crimes and things like that, I mean, that is not socially, that does not function properly in society. Is it possible? Are there any interventions that are scientifically validated to change that person?
Yeah, if we talk about psychopaths versus sociopaths, it turns out that sociopaths tend to grow out of this anger, and this vindictiveness and abusive behavior, and some can be treated with cognitive behavioral therapy, empathic sorts of retraining. They can, but psychopaths, to this day, nobody has really shown that can happen. But, if they'll say, well, look we have somebody who was a psychopath and now for a year they've been fine. Well, I had in my office here, National Public Radio, an interviewer came and they said they had talked to somebody who was probably the best known researcher for curing psychopaths, adult psychopaths. And so she was out here in Los Angeles to interview that person and his wife. He was out of prison and he was a young guy and he was one of the cured people. And the researcher and the clinician who told this research said, you should talk to Jim Fallon because he doesn't believe it. He doesn't believe there is a way to really cure these people. Even though everybody wants that to be, but there's no real evidence. And so as we're talking, she gets a phone call and says, wait a second. And she goes outside and talks to somebody on the phone. She goes, Jim, the interview is over. That was the guy I was going to talk to tomorrow in Los Angeles. He's back in prison. He beat her up. He almost killed her last night. So here was their star student. But, about a year or so had gone by. And it's like you can look at psychopathy as an addiction in a way. It's an addiction to certain behavior patterns that are very pernicious and antisocial. And that anybody can be cured of, on New Year's Day. They'll say, I'm not going to drink anymore. I'm not going to cheat on my wife anymore. They always have the New Year's resolution, New Year's Eve resolution. And everybody can do it for a few days, a week, sometimes some months. And then, but 95% of the people snap back. They go back to the same old behaviors. And I've talked to, over the years, priests and rabbis and imams about people's confessions or their types of sins when they've talked to them about it. And I said, do people tend to just have different sins, or do they have the same sin over and over again? And they said, well, they have the same mortal sins over and over again. Well, it's easier to call them sins because you can be absolved and forgiven of a sin. It's better than calling them psychopathy, for which there is no cure. And so you can see the usefulness of some religion is that you're saved, you're forgiven, whereas the real thing might be psychopathy that never goes away and you keep doing it. And this is the pattern we see. So in a way, you can look at psychopathy like an addiction to something that you never really get rid of, but you can get rid of for maybe a month, couple of months, a few months, but then you revert back to your old ways.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, going back to the nature-nurture debate, I mean, you've already gave us an answer about that, but do you think that the debate itself still makes sense?
Well, there's no scientific explanation that's ever over. It's always something new. So it's never going to be over because we know that every part of science is in flux. There is no truth uh, that we know of, and the truth always changes the more you look at it, or the granularity, how fine you look at it versus how broad you look at it, and so it's never over, right? The debates are going to always be there, and since we really know very little about the detailed epigenetic effects and for psychopathy and other psychiatric disorders, we know very little. We kind of know a bit. Then certainly it's very much alive as a narrative and a discussion. Uh, Part of this is the difficulty in proving something like this is that in epigenetics, especially for these social behaviors, you have the interaction of a gene or the promoter of a gene, okay, like MAOA, and what happens early on is this high stress, high trauma releases cortisol from your adrenal gland, and that goes to the frontal lobe and temporal lobe of the brain, where it binds to these genes. Now, if in people with certain alleles, that binding early on looks like it's permanent, and if it happens later, it's not permanent. Okay, and it's very similar to the immune system. There's always epigenetic changes. When you get a new form of COVID, new form of flu coming through, you alter the epigenetic regulation of the lymphoid cells, of the white blood cells, so that they can respond to the new virus or bacteria. So this is happening all the time. And after 3 weeks, that epigenetic change, the methyl groups or the acetyl groups that are added onto these gene regulators, they pop off and you're back to where you were. But if it happens early, that's why this window between birth and 2 years old seems to be so important, then they stay stuck. So they stay methylated. Well, how do you prove that? Well, you've got to take people who are diagnosed psychopaths or these different disorders, and you have to take their fresh brain and look for methylation. We have no way of really seeing that right now. Mm-hmm. So to prove it, you've got to have a fresh killed brain, a fresh dead brain, and where you're looking at the methylation of these and correlating them. Well, that will take years to do because you have to wait until somebody dies and they allow you to take their brain. And by the very nature, psychopaths are not very cooperative. So it makes it even harder. So to get to that level of proof, the first level, we're not there yet. So the argument still is alive because you have to show, you have to do this in different groups of people and enough people. You have to do it in hundreds and hundreds of people to really make it convincing. So until that happens, the debate's open.
Mm-hmm. So earlier in our discussion, at a certain point, you mentioned how you and other people who are highly trained and experienced in looking at brain scans can predict people's personality from patterns of brain activation and stuff like that. But is it possible to predict behaviors from brain scans?
Well, I think so. Yeah. I mean, I've done it many times. I've been given blind. I don't know. I'll say, send me these scans and I'll tell you what this person's behavior patterns, if they're really significantly different than, a normal person. And I've done this many times, and people like me, certainly, probably done it better than I have. So yes, you can. You can say these are the patterns of behavior of this person based on detailed scans, and it's helped if you have the genetics too. That's really very helpful. And it doesn't mean you can predict if they're a criminal, or predict if they have a psychiatric disorder, but you can predict behaviors. Yes.
So with that in mind, to what extent would you say behavior is determined?
Well, if you're born and raised in a normal family, okay, and I'm not talking about parents who are giving you everything and everything's sweet. I mean, I'm normal. You know, you get into fights, you may have arguments, you may get some traumas. That normal level, then you will tend to be what your genes are. You'll just tend to do that. And so, like I had mentioned before, if you talk to parents, uh, and they'll say, I'm gonna create this child in my own image, and then you talk to them at 20 when the children are 21, and they'll say, I knew that son of a bitch was no good from the beginning. See, they'll change their mind. Everybody has great hope, and as a parent, you don't want to just know, look at, just make sure the child has enough food, enough love, and is not abused. They want to do more. They want to be the greatest parent in the world, but it's an illusion.
Yeah. So just
I didn't
one.
really answer your question the way you wanted me to answer your question. So what other part do you want me to address that's embedded in your question?
Well, okay. So of course, this is more of a philosophical question, but from the point of view of a neuroscientist, as you are, does the idea of free will make sense?
I think free will is oversold. You know, I'm a libertarian. I said Locke was wrong. You know, Locke was kind of a libertarian, right? Well, my own people are wrong on this, I think. And so it's painful to say this, you know, because all the libertarians, in terms of the idea of free will, are wrong, because you know a lot of it is biologically determined. That doesn't mean we're not responsible for our behavior. Free will and responsibility can be different things, as you know. And so if you do something, you go to prison if it's really bad, and even though you're still very dangerous, and even though you say, well, I didn't have the free will to do it, too bad. You're determined by your behavior, what you did and what you do, and so that's you can, for me, you can firewall it out, and as a libertarian, I can live with that, you know, because libertarians are extremely liberal on behavior, right? Don't don't force anybody to do anything unless you're actually harming somebody else directly, not indirectly, but directly. And and so philosophically, it pains me to say no. I think the idea of free will is very oversold. And uh, now, does that mean there's no free will? I think, you know, somebody in a normal, regular person can think about something and decide whether they're going to do something that goes against their emotional urges or drives at that moment. Therefore, that's defined as free will. Now, in my own behavior, I can tell you what I've tried myself, which is I try, uh, and this only started 10 years ago when I realized my own behavior was not great. And so I looked carefully at other people, other men my age, and other women too, who had kids and grandkids, and saw how they interacted with their mates. And I realized that I wasn't doing that. I was being selfish like about 100 times a day. I did the most selfish thing. I didn't think that before. I thought I was freely doing something else, but I wasn't. Uh, and so then I've tried to train myself every day. I have to do this. I have to think to myself cognitively that I will, in my interactions with people, I will try not to manipulate them. I'll try to treat them with respect. I will try to treat them morally according to the morals of the society. All of these things, but I have to think of it every day, and I just do it. See, that is my form of free will. I am going to overcome my natural tendencies to do this. But for me, it's like treating an addiction. I have to accept that my natural behavior is not great, and then overcome it by thinking about it all the time. It's exhausting. It really is. And if I don't do that, I snap right back. I lose my free will. But in the moments when I'm not driven, I say I have the free will to do things that will make me more social and moral and et cetera. So to that extent, I think you can, right? But it takes work. It's not just because if I go back to my natural self it will be the same shit, you know?
So let me just ask you one last question about psychopathy. Are you interested also in trying to understand if there's any evolutionary explanation for the existence of psychopaths? I mean, could it be that even if they are a minority across human societies, the behaviors they exhibit could be, at least to some extent and in some contexts, adaptive?
Yeah. Adaptive and good. Not just adaptive, but good. You know, when I say good, that's a value-laden term. And so we define what psychopaths doing is not good, as evil, or you know, as being not only maladaptive for themselves and others, but not good. But that's defined by the interaction with other people or their own family or clan, their little social group, all right? Their society. But that same behavior may be great for the species. So what's good for the species? Mixing genes up, having a robust gene pool. And how do you do that? Well, by having sex with a lot of people. So who are the ones that go over the mountain? They leave their village, they go over the mountain and try to have sex and rape everybody. Well, those are psychopaths. And they're great for the species. If you don't have them, you have a very weak species. So they're good for the species, right? And so, you know, the finding that every society, and probably forever, in hominin societies, that there have always been psychopaths. Just as there's always been shamans who were kind of schizoaffective. They have a schizoaffective disorder, they have visions, think outside of the box. Well, here, psychopaths actually go out of their own box into other people's boxes and, you know, and have random sex. That's great for the species and terrible for individuals in society, you know, in families. And so you have to define what kind of good. So in that way, psychopaths are very useful in creating a lot of mixing of genes and creating a robust species. And that's one. Who will take what type of person has the constant energy and fearlessness? You know, one of the main group of traits for psychopaths, it's called fearless dominance. That fearless dominance is a resistance to stress, to pain. When, you know, fearless dominance, when they walk into the room, they have a light around them. They have that light that's people call charisma, leadership. It's a type of leadership skill. So they tend to be in leadership roles. They tend to be not care about stress or anxiety. And they will do things that other people won't do. And they're quite good at it. And so they're very useful for different, you know, for leadership in some, you know, military groups, in some investment. It's amazing. They're not driven by fear. So they make very cold-hearted decisions, which are, you know, financially quite good. And, you know, and if you have a cardiac or a neurosurgeon, you don't want them crying every time somebody their patient dies or is in pain. You want a machine doing this. And so they're good in certain respects. That doesn't mean that neurosurgeons and cardiologists are psychopaths. You know, a fair number are. But they also, you know, the highest rate of psychopathy is in journalism. That's where you find it because they can manipulate large groups of people with what they write and say. And we can see this has gotten worse and worse. The amount of lying and the amount of terrible, you know, ridiculous news and interpretations that has gone on the past 10 years, it's quite unbelievable. And with social media, so people in social media, journalists, this is where you find most psychopaths. Well, is this a good thing? You know, most of us say no, but if you want to dominate a society, you say, no, that's good. You see, our political group likes to lie, and we don't mind lying, and then we get to rule the world. You know, it's like if you're a Nazi or you're a Stalinist, a communist or something, this is great. We don't think lying is bad because we're going to change the world. And so we do all these things. We murder, we rape, we lie because we're going to make the world a better place. This is so it depends on whose ox is getting gored. And so people will say, well, see, that's useful because who's going to do that? And will psychopaths do that?
Yeah. So, Dr. Fallon, before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Well, if you look up James Fallon, and if you're interested in stem cells, you put James Fallon stem cells. But if you're interested in sort of psychopathy, I do a lot of work on dictators. I'm doing a lot of talks on Putin in the past couple of months, the past month. I've been talking about Putin for 10 years and other tyrants. And I work with organizations that try to overthrow governments. But since I'm a libertarian, I only work with people who do it peacefully, through persuasion. So I use my own, say, your own psychopathy to talk people out of it. So if you look up James Fallon dictator, you'll get talks, many of them about an hour long, and we're now putting a documentary together on Putin, but other dictators, the dictator type. What's the brain of a dictator? And I've been doing that for about 12, 13 years. But if you put James Fallon, either psychopathy or dictator or whatever, because I do other things too, that will get you there.
Okay.
If people are interested. And yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Great talking to you too, Ricardo. And you're very well prepared. It's a good question, so thanks.
Thank you so much.
Well prepared. It's a good question, so thanks.
Thank you so much. Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, hit the subscription button, all of those things you already know. And please consider supporting the show either on PayPal or Patreon. All of the links will be in the description box of the interview, starting at $1 per month, so it would be a great help. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litske and Blanchett, Pererga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vosbo, Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windager, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bulut, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yasila Des Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Antonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy and Trader in NYC. My producers Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luis Caetano, Tom Van Nagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codreanu, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.